So welcome everybody. Welcome to the first course in this series for the California Native Plant Landscaper Certificate Program. My name is Catherine Pacardini. I'm going to be your instructor for the 8 courses. We'll do a little bit of just introduction and general discussion, just so that the last few people who need to make it on have an opportunity to do that. And I am hearing chimes. There we go. And then I have on the participant list a Robert Silva. I'm having a hard time muting that one for some reason. All right. Okay. So to get started, I just want to get an impression of where you guys are coming from and what you guys want to get out of the class. So before I do any kind of a course, whether it's just a 1-hour workshop or if it's going to be a longer duration course, I like to get a feel for who the audience is, what you guys want to get out of this class or this course or this series of courses, and where you're coming from as far as your profession and your maybe already experience with native plants or non-experience with native plants, etc. So for the next few minutes, what I'm going to have you do, this will also double as our roll call. And so what I'd like you to do is use the chat feature. So if you go to the kind of, I don't know if it's a toolbar or such, but you can use the chat to type in your full name, first and last name. This is going to serve as your roll call. But under that, I'd like to hear kind of your profession or where you're coming from. If you're, I'm a private landscaper, and then what you hope to get out of the class. And I'm, using this course so that I can expand my client base, for instance. So put it all in one. Ruben Martinez is not getting any sound. And you can do this to everyone. Everyone can read it. You can do it straight to me as well. Actually, no, do it to everyone. Don't do it as a private direct message. So use the chat to put the full first name, last name, and under that in the same box, tell me where you're coming from, who you work for, whether you work for yourself. I'm a private landscaper. I work with a crew. I'm very already familiar with native plants, or I'm not as familiar with native plants. And then under that, tell me what you want to get from this class. Tell me if you are, I'm hoping to increase my marketability. And just a moment, I'm going to try to mute. Because there's, again, a bunch of background noise. All right. So if you can keep yourselves on mute, just as a general practice throughout the class, just because we have so many people, every little background noise is going to influence everyone's ability to hear the content. So again, open up the chat, give your full name. Perfect. So we have an example here. George Zhang, garden educator, master gardener, part-time landscaper. On mute. Oh, let's put you on mute. Make sure you're on mute. Master gardener, part-time landscaper, Santa Monica, limited knowledge about native plants and want to learn more. So this is really great. That's exactly the kind of thing I want you guys to say, where you're coming from, what you want to get out of the class. It will help me to understand how to customize the content of the course. If I have an impression of, am I dealing with a bunch of people who are already really seasoned in native plants? Am I not? Or these people who are private, gardeners and landscapers? Are they part of a team? Those kinds of things. I'm sure with a class this large, we're probably going to have a really nice mix of everybody. And so I'm going to do my best to try to make sure to tailor kind of the content so that everybody kind of gets something that they're looking for. And frankly, if your answer is, hey, I'm already really familiar with native plants and I literally just want the certificate so I can put it on my resume, and increase my ability to get jobs, that's a valid reason too. So if you're already really knowledgeable, you already work with native plants, you're already been in the industry, and this is just your, you know, something that you want to do for, you know, increase job qualifications or anything like that, then feel free to put that and be honest. So great. Okay, so we're getting some really good answers here. Roger is an architect, wants to learn more about the natural environment, so more kind of ecological understanding about the environment and as how it probably pertains to architecture is really, really relevant. Really great. Make sure you're putting your full name in the chat so that we can take an appropriate roll call. We have Miguel, San Manuel Public Works crew lead, excellent, familiar with native plants, want to obtain more knowledge on native plants, great. All right, Mary Pat Schuster, older student hoping to take the ISA arborist exam and wants to switch professions, so that's awesome. We have the next one says, I work in the education nonprofit sector, but do my own private landscaping as a side job. This is an introduction for me as I try to learn more about native plants. Great. Evan has been a freelance landscaper for different parts of the country, moved back to Cali or California. I'm hoping to expand native plant knowledge and become a better landscaper. All right, cool. And Richard, you're part of that same. Oh, awesome. Native reservation in San Bernardino, trying to open own landscaping business. Excellent. Tried to educate myself about native plants. That's fantastic. We have currently designing a landscape of all natives for the family. Longtime native plant advocate from Charles Miller. On the board of directors of Westwood Greenway. Very relevant experienced US GBC member, currently training for Lee Green Associate Accreditation, hoping to obtain more skills. Fantastic. Also pick up tips for weeding and maintaining the Westwood Greenway. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Westwood Greenway, you can Google it. It's an amazing, amazing project. All right, more crew lead. This is fantastic. Part of that crew. A student at Azusa Pacific University, an intern, expanding knowledge. So I'm seeing people, most people wanting to kind of expand their knowledge, maybe have some knowledge, but working to expand. Brian, highly recommended to take the certificate program, great. Looking forward to planting a house of mostly natives. Moosa Creek, cool. So Moosa Creek is another native plant nursery. That's excellent. Want to learn more landscaping with natives, so a larger body of knowledge to pull from when I speak to customers. So that's fantastic. That's a really, really relevant use of this course, I would say, for sure. Interior plant curator with her own business from Brooke, trying to expand her knowledge to help assist clients, water-wise landscaping. Excited to learn more. Tree people, we have quite, I think, a few people at Tree People. We have Santos, Emily, Jack. Somehow you're all in the same order here. Tree People, community urban forester, want to learn more to implement more native landscaping. That's great. Nursery coordinator with Tree People, familiar with native plants in the Santa Monica Mountains, but less with horticultural cultivars, which is great. We have Jack. Tree People, ecological restoration nursery manager in the Santa Monica Mountains, Angeles National Forest, to receive more training so the plants will be happier. Yay. I'm excited to have you in the class, Jack. Ryan wants to use this course to expand his knowledge on native plants, see on the reservation at San Manuel, and work with the landscaper of a crew of 4 or 5 spot out plants, know what they are, how they're supposed to be taken care of, which are toxic and non-toxic. That's cool. To know. Monarch Fellowship. Forgive me if I'm just reading through these and they're not as fun for you to just hear me read them out, but it kind of gives me a good impression. Plus you get to understand where some of these other, your colleagues that you're going to be kind of in the same cohort for the next 8 courses, where they're coming from too. And hopefully there'll be a little bit of, even though we're not in person, but hopefully there'll be some form of camaraderie. If you guys do attend the 2 in-person workshops, you can start putting names to faces and hopefully getting to know one another a bit. And so want to know how to grow native nectar plants good for monarchs, monarch butterflies, how to take care of them, how to plant seedlings and milkweed. So this is milkweed giveaways. That's awesome. Urban forestry in South LA, fantastic. From Kyle, and then Rylan, organic urban farmer, working to grow edibles in the backyard. Love to do native landscapes for people outside in the garden. So that's great. We have San Manuel Public Works again. Want to learn, that's Victor Perez. Fantastic. Lisa says she's a landscape designer with Levitt and Moss Architects in Santa Monica. All right, let's make sure we're muted. We heard a few more.
Turn them on.
Oh, there we go again. Here. I will mute. Okay. And so it's really great. Stephen Garcia, thank you. Paul, I work on landscaping crew. So this is a really great representation. I'm really excited about that. Baron, that was a direct message for your name, just so that my the host of the Zoom, who our colleague here can take an accurate roll call. If you can put that your name as a message to everyone. All right. We got another rep from Tree People, Anna Karen and Nick. Resource for community members. So this is fantastic. Ella, are you the new, you can just put it in the chat, but are you the new TPF staff member? Oh, pardon me, staff member? Yay, cool. Excellent. All right, well, welcome. Ruben, Stephen, I think I got everyone. Jaya, incorporate residential landscape. Okay, so I'm seeing some really cool stuff here. Buddhist, hello Buddhist, landscape architecture. All right. Please mute yourself. Somehow I always do a mute
Your
all.
earbuds, Ruben bought you, they would work.
One person.
Yeah, don't have those either.
Hold on. All righty. So let me just read that last one. I was reading Vodesh. Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Okay. Landscape architecture, some experience with native plants in larger parks, more interested in smaller residential scale garden design with specific focus on learning about hardy native plants that do well in garden settings. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of compatibility here with what people want to learn, as well as what they are, you know, what people want to learn and what people's experiences are. So I'm, for those of you who have a lot of native plant knowledge already, there may be things in this course that are going to be repetitive knowledge or you already know. For those of you who don't, you are certainly going to be learning a lot in this sequence of classes. And also keep in mind with regards to this course is that it is a, it's a work in progress kind of course that we're constantly refining and constantly making better each time. And so your input and your ability to give us some feedback on it is going to be important. So as you're going through here, if you feel like, hey, we didn't touch enough on such and such a topic for me, or we did too much of this, keep notes of that, because each time the course is getting better, and we're going to be offering this class past the 1 year, kind of grant period that was awarded by the LADWP that enabled this course to kind of come to life.
Still can't hear anything. My volume on my computer is up.
All right. Okay. And are all you seeing my screen when every single time I pop open the window? Okay, that's going to be annoying. All right, so what I'm going to do real quickly is stop the share, and I'm only going to share my PowerPoint screen, which is going to kind of throw off later on one of my presentations, but it will help so that you're not seeing every. Oh, and then somebody else said, no, we can only see your PowerPoint screen. Well, let's try that. Okay, all right. Okay. All right, so forgive me for certain little technical housekeeping things that we have to do in the beginning. So yes, please keep in mind the course is always evolving organic process. Keep keep notes about what you like about it, what you might think could be done better, what you'd like to learn more of, what you felt you learned too much of, etc. Because we're always trying to refine it and make it better and better each time. Just so you guys are aware, this course was made possible from a grant from the LADWP. So there are significant sections of the course material that are going to be focused on LADWP programs and rebates. That includes the lawn turf replacement rebate program and other kinds of rebates with regards to more efficient irrigation nozzles and things like that. And so you're gonna, if that's really relevant to your work, you're gonna find that really useful. If you maybe don't do residential work much, you might find that part a little bit less useful. So I'm gonna have you just think in your head, get out of this what is gonna be most useful to you, and make sure that you're kind of just, if something isn't really applicable to your profession or your goals, it's okay. You don't have to worry about it too much. It's just that we do have to kind of like cover all of our bases and all of the content. So we are going to move on. So thank you everybody who put themselves in the chat, both for roll call, but also to give us a little bit of information. We're going to start with our land acknowledgement. For those of you who are familiar with land acknowledgements, this is one that we're going to use today, but you can also go a little more specific to who you guys are and where you are kind of in place. You can go to native-land.ca and you can literally type in your address and see which native territory your particular city or your house basically is resting on. And so you can do like a very zoomed in specific personal land acknowledgement for yourself, but this is the one that we're going to use today. We acknowledge the original stewards of what is now Los Angeles County, the Kich Gabrieleño, Tongva, Chumash, Tataviam, Kitanemuk, Serrano, Luiseño, and Cahuilla people. We commit to uplifting the names of these lands and the community members from more than 200 California First Nations who reside among us, and we honor their traditional ecological knowledge. That's kind of just a general overview land acknowledgement. One of the reasons why we do land acknowledgements is not to sound sanctimonious or anything like that, but it's to show a certain degree of respect for the fact that this is a space that has been part of human culture for more than 10,000 years. And that's a fact that unfortunately in this country, people seem to forget. American culture, generally, I would say collective understanding of time is very, very short. There tends to be this understanding that nothing existed here before Europeans came and colonized this land. And that of course is grossly completely not true. And so it's really important that we do these land acknowledgements so that we know that human civilization, cultures, communities have and do in the present tense exist here in Los Angeles County, in Southern California, wherever you are. If you do happen to be somewhere not in Southern California, please, you can use that native.land.ca to find out exactly where your territory is. So with that, so this particular certificate course content, the curriculum is in this order. So these are the different lessons. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lessons on Zoom. And then we're going to have 2 workshops. And the workshops are optional workshops that happen after between the 4th and 5th. And then I believe after the 8th. So it's kind of like a 9th lesson, so to speak, or almost a 10th lesson. And those are going to be optional in-person workshops if you can make it out. They're actually going to be taking place at Tree People, which is really cool. But if it's out of your way, that's totally fine. But as far as content of what we're going to be covering, we obviously are going to touch upon the value of this certificate program itself in terms of your professional ability to utilize it, and also the whole life cycle kind of a garden. The second class, which will be Friday, is going to go a little bit more into plant identification. We're going to cover some of the more common native plant species, talk about them, share some photos. And then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of soil. The 4th and 5th are probably going to be the slightly more complex courses on irrigation. And with irrigation, the 4th, I would say the 5th one's a little bit more mathy. We're going to go into a little bit more certain technical things. It's not going to be the technicals of installing irrigation. So this is not that kind of a course, but it's more to understand the theory of native plant irrigation and how we should be irrigating and a little bit of the science of it. And then it will also feature a more lengthy talk about the rebate program and various rebates that you can qualify from an LADWP representative on that course. And then we're going to talk weeding and IPM, that's integrated pest management. Pruning, so pruning is really fun. The cool thing about the pruning is more that it's even more fun in person. So I would do for sure, if you can make it out to these in-person workshops. It's one thing to talk about how to prune something, it's another to actually do it. And then the last course is going to be garden assessment and utilizing your certificate, kind of a nice wrap up to everything that we've done thus far. Periodically, I will check out people's chats. But I will, if you have questions in the chat as we're going along, if you have some questions, feel free to put them in the chat, but I might not read them as you do them. I might wait till a few slides have gone by, then check the chat, just so you know that tends to be a little bit less distracting. That way I can also just hit a bunch of questions at once. All right, so this is your workshop number 1, value and garden life. So the objectives of this session, to be able to articulate the benefits of using a California native plant certified landscaper. That is for a person who doesn't know the difference between one who's certified and one who's not. We want to be able to justify and really speak to the value of somebody who's certified in California native plant landscaping, and why that's just a big plus in general for the ecosystem, for that client's maybe individual garden, etc. And then to also understand what a 4-year and beyond garden timeframe looks like. So a brand new garden is going to be treated, planted, maintained, attended to much more differently than a 4-year garden. And so we're going to kind of go into a little bit of a progression of what that looks like and how your care for the space will change based on that. So, the value of your certificate of completion. This is an example of the certificate that you will get at the end of the course. In fact, if you want it in person, you want it in your hand, then you will ideally attend the last in-person pruning workshop. Because if you do that, you will most likely get that certificate in your hand. If you don't attend it, I think it's mailed to you. I don't know that it matters either way, but if you want it, you want to take a picture with us with the certificate in your hand, then that's make sure to come to the last workshop. So the value of the certificate, we're hoping that this gets to the point where people are, you'll be more qualified for a particular job because of that. I mean, that's kind of already the way it is, but we'd love to see a point where, it's become so commonplace and people are so knowledgeable about this stuff that it becomes put on job descriptions of saying like, hey, we want you to have the California Native Plant Landscaper certificate before you apply. And so that would be really cool, is if we create this kind of community of people who are knowledgeable about this stuff to the point that it becomes so understood that in the industry, when people are asking for people with certain credentials, this is one of those credentials. So job advancement, this expands your ability to tend to lots of different kinds of landscapes. So it might be that you're able to reach another level of your profession because you have it. Marketing is probably the biggest one. So one of the things that there's a big gap in is people are really starting to, like I just experienced this today. I have a client, I just placed all the plants. He's gonna have his more conventional landscaper plant them. But that landscaper doesn't do native plant landscapes. So he said, like, I can't maintain them, I'll plant them for you, but you'll probably have to hire somebody who knows native plants. And so, there are people in that position where they themselves don't want to garden for their, in their own garden. They want to hire somebody, and they want somebody who has some knowledge of native plants. And so you get to market yourself as one of those people. And there's a big market for that right now. And then as far as the bigger picture, the whole point is most of us have seen the value of native plants. We know that a native plant has co-evolved with other species of insects and pollinators. We have somebody in the audience who works with monarchs. We know the value of the native plants for supporting biodiversity. And so by being somebody who can appropriately care for, tend, and steward a space with native plants and maintain that habitat and really enrich the environment, you're actually just, from a bigger picture, helping to create more wildlife connectivity, improve biodiversity, really kind of support the resurgence of a healthy ecology, whether you're somewhere rural or in an urban center. So what is just a native plant in general? When we talk about native plants, most of us are familiar, but we're talking about indigenous plants, plants that were not brought here, but have existed here, co-evolved here with the plants, the animals, the geology of California prior to European colonial influence and impact. And so this is really, really important in California. If you take a look at the United States map, there's so much biodiversity in California because of how unique the geology is, how unique so many different types of soil types, so many different types of elevation, so many different types of kind of coastal influence, inland influences. And so it's a very, very rich biologic zone. And so it is considered a biodiversity hotspot. And a biodiversity hotspot, there are only 36 biodiversity hotspots on the planet. So 36 of them on the entire planet. Only 2.5% of the Earth's land surface is considered a biodiversity hotspot. And yet the biodiversity hotspot has some of the highest concentrations of diversity and form with regards to plant life, that it's crucial that we conserve it. And so California, to be designated as a biodiversity hotspot, you have to have more than 1,500 species of plants that are endemic to the region. Endemic means that they're from that space and they occur nowhere else on the planet. So if you lose them, they're off the planet. They're gone forever. There's no like backup supply in Texas or another, in some other country, there's a plant that's the same species. If we lose it in California, we lose it from the whole planet. So that's how essential it is that we conserve these kind of spaces and also replant these spaces with those kinds of plants. The other thing that designates it as a biodiversity hotspot is how threatened it is. So a biodiversity hotspot has to have had more than 70% of its natural vegetation already lost, already heavily impacted, already diminished by human activity, by development, by agriculture, by what have you. And so California falls under that unfortunate designation, both in a good sense that, Conservation International has said this needs to be a primary focus of conservation, but also in a bad sense where it's a focus of conservation because we're killing it. And so it's really, really important when we talked about the big picture of what this work is, that even in a residential garden, you're supporting that big picture of promoting and supporting biodiversity in a really rich and incredible space and environment. So this, and unfortunately I can't see the title of this because my bars and things are in the way. But what's great about this certificate, this is the only certificate that focuses on California native plants. There's no other landscaping certificate out there that is exclusively focusing on California native plants. It does improve the marketability of certified gardeners. It makes your resume stand out. You get to put it under like certificates and other, skills and such. So it really does help market you. It provides customers and vendors with validation that you have demonstrated experience, knowledge, and skills in this specialty. It is a very specialized thing that you guys are entering into. It's not something that's easy for lots of people to do. And so this is actually a really incredible kind of badge of honor that you get to wear after, because it really shows a certain degree of credibility to you guys to have gone through these courses. And it's also backed and supported by Theodore Payne Foundation, obviously, CNPS, which is the California Native Plant Society, and the US Green Building Council. And so these are extremely respected names in native plant gardening and green infrastructure locally. And then, like I mentioned before, it's also funded by the LADWP. And so it's got a bunch of big name partners here who are kind of supporting it. So to use it, you can identify yourself as certified on your name badge. If you guys wear name badges as part of your job, if you're on your crew and you've got a name badge, you can put that information on your name badge. You can include the certificate logo and customer proposals. So that's a really good thing when you're putting out a proposal for work. You can include that logo. You can show it at meetings with potential clients. You can logo your vehicle with the decal. So you would get an actual vehicle decal you can stick on your truck. And so you'll be able to be identified even while you're en route to a job as a certified native plant landscaper. And you're, just hold that pride in your heart as you move around, because that's it's not easy to earn a certificate of this kind. There's quite a number of courses to take. It's not easy with people who are professionals who are working all day to be doing this at 6:30 right now, or whatever time it is. This is, you're showing a level of commitment that not a lot of people would do. And certificate holders, employers, and homeowners can contact Theodore Payne for verification. So if for some reason somebody was to question, are you really certified? They can certainly contact Theodore Payne, and we would verify your certification. So it would be doubly legit. So your benefits: frameable professional certificate, which I showed you before what it looked like, and then decal stickers to let potential clients recognize your additional training. As far as financial aspects, we're going to do a little bit of talking about the financial aspects of native plant landscaping, how some of what we're talking about are a little bit more specialized services, or maybe they require a little bit additional time or investment. And so you could conceivably, start charging for more for certain things that you do. And training on proper planning, proper use of tools and materials, and the maintenance can save costs in that way. So you can start earning more money, but then you can also potentially maybe even reduce the number of tools, certain types of tools that you have to use. So when we're comparing maybe the conventional like mow and blow type of gardening with this, you're going to start to see some differences where you're able to maybe save money in certain aspects, get more money in others. All right, so let me check the time. Oh, we're doing like really well. Okay, cool. It's 6:39. Oh, okay, before we get into the life of a garden, has everybody gotten their student handbook? So everybody should have received a student handbook that goes along with this course. If you have not, maybe put it in the chat if you haven't. So Richard, you got it, great. So if you have not received your student handbook, all right, cool. So far, everybody's have it. You have not. Ari has not received the handbook. Okay, so need to pick it up. So has anybody, okay, so you don't have the flashcards for Mary. Most people seem to have it so far. If you have the electronic version, that's fine. So if you have the electronic version, all the same content is on here. But if you can pick it up, I believe from Theodore Payne. And I don't know if you've been in touch with Brenda. Brenda's the one who does that. Great, we have Alizane and please forgive me if I misspelled your name. We have a digital version that you can access as well. All right, great. So I highly encourage you guys to use this as your resource. Aside from the fact that it is just cool, each of the courses are kind of divided up, and some of the content that is maybe more introductory, that I'm not necessarily going into, like what is a native plant, or let's see what is there, how to replace turf grass. So you have lots of really cool opportunities to do like follow-up, more in-depth maybe follow-up information. So lawn removal and alternative guides. There are lots of little like handouts and guides that supplement the material that we're going to be talking about, as well as other resources, as well as a little section on notes. So you can do a little section. All right, we're going to make sure everyone's muted. All right. A little section where you can write notes. There's one thing on here, for instance, that is, what is a California native plant, about California native plants, what native plants can do, etc. So please make sure that you're using this to your benefit. We're not going to go through every single thing in there. So there's some things that they've put in as additional supplemental resources for you. So please take advantage of that. The other thing that you will get, if you haven't already received, is your set of flashcards. So these flashcards go through all sorts of different types of California native plants. So we do not need to access these for our homework assignment today, but I believe tomorrow's homework assignment, not tomorrow, next class's homework assignment will utilize the flashcards. So those are two little additional fun resources for you guys to please take advantage of. And they'll also just support the course curriculum. All right, so when we talk about the life of a garden, we're going to go through the example for caring for a new installation. So depending on where you're from, again, if you're out in the Santa Monica Mountains and you're planting a tree, that is going to take a different kind of care than maybe what I'm going to show you as an example of a residential garden installation. However, it's really good to understand the whole life cycle of a garden, just in general, because it gives you a kind of an understanding of the life cycle of native plants as well. And also we're going to discuss not only the life cycle of the garden itself, but how you would adjust your landscaping practices or your maintenance practices or activities based on the age of the garden. So, but before that, this is about the lawn rebate. And so this is something that we put in here to give you a understanding of the fact that many of these residential landscapes may be qualified for these lawn rebates. And you should keep in mind that if you're going to go for a lawn rebate type of a program, you cannot remove the lawn first and then apply for the rebate. You have to have the lawn in place. They have to inspect that there was a lawn. Then you remove it. Then you can, you know, after you do the whatever else is qualified for the rebate, then you get qualified for the rebate. But if you have removed the lawn already and then you decide to apply, you won't get the rebate. So that's just a little bit of a tip before we get into the actual installation of a garden. So let's say this was part of the rebate program. At this stage, it would have been too late to apply for the money back kind of rebate for this job. This would still be a wonderful thing to do, but it wouldn't qualify for the LADWP program. So when this was a lawn, let's say that that's what it was before, then you apply for the rebate, you get approved, then you begin this work. So this is your first bit of work. This is year one. This is a new client wants a new landscape design. You may never encounter a scenario where you're actually installing the very first design. Maybe you're going to do maintenance on a garden that's already established. So in that case, you know, maybe this is not, you know, you're going to be your focus. But more often than not, there will be a design and installation component to what you're doing. And so this is kind of going to cover that. So Brian asks if the LADWP rebate program is for LA County or LA City. It is, I believe, for LA City. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure. Okay, so your strategy, you can see the photo is of a newly installed or in progress installation of a new pathway with dirt and potentially mulch in the planter areas. And so the first year of a garden is going to be probably, you're going to kind of front load that garden with a lot more attention and work and time. And over time, you're going to start to taper off and not have to do as much. But in the beginning, it's going to be dependent on your client demand. The size of the garden is definitely going to matter, and it's going to vary widely from garden to garden. But this is going to be your biggest time investment, is going to be in this initial stage. So activities that you might do include creating a plant list. So this is when you would be, you know, identifying the locations of, you know, where the sun hits, where is it shady, where will this plant grow, where will the tree look best, where are there irrigation lines, do we need to install things. So it's going to be a lot of that assessment, but then you'll be able to do mulching at this time, creating berms or swales. So berms and swales are useful to be able to capture runoff from the roof. So for instance, you can make a rain garden by capturing redirecting the water that comes out of the downspout into the garden. So that's another ecological principle, landscaping principle that's not necessarily native plant centric, but it fits within the model of ecological landscaping that we want to see implemented more and more in people's spaces. But it is also a requirement, some form of water capture, whether it's capturing it in a swale that allows the water to percolate into the soil, or capturing it in a rain barrel. Some kind of water capture feature is required for the LADWP lawn rebate. But even if it's not, I highly encourage you to consider some form of land formation, manipulation in order to allow water to stay in the landscape and then actually drain and percolate. So you're not going to do this right against your house. You want to keep, for homes without a basement, I think at least 5 feet away. For homes that have like an underground basement, you want to do that about 10 feet away from the home's foundation. But you want to make sure that this precious resource called water in our drought-stricken California and Southern California especially, gets to really get absorbed into the space and into the ground and into the landscape. It will benefit your plants. It won't be wasting resources. And then if you think about if you take a Google image shot of any part of, say, like a city, look how much concrete there is. Look how much we've paved over every permeable surface possible. The amount of impermeability, the inability for water to actually go into the ground is so high. No wonder we're in a drought situation. We are exacerbating the drought by making it so much worse, because the water that we do get doesn't get to go actually into the ground. It rushes off into the street, goes into a storm drain, into a river, and then out into the ocean. And the opportunity to kind of support life in the form of plants and habitat is lost. So I do encourage you to think about that with any landscape. How are we maximizing water on the site and reducing water waste? So evaluating runoff potential. So there is an actual formula. So you could take, and we can get into the formula, and I think the formula is even in your handbook, but you can figure out how much roof space you have and calculate how many gallons would come out in the event of like 2 inches of rain, for instance, and be able to kind of do some of that math before you start excavating. So there's a lot of like kind of planning and prep work to be done in the first year, which is why I said you're going to be spending a lot more time initially. This is the time also, once you get the land formed the way you want, to sow wildflowers and plant your plants. So that's going to be your first, your first year is going to be planting and sowing seeds, and believe it or not, that happens kind of like at the end of all that other process. So you can mulch beforehand, move the plant away, plant your plant, put the mulch back, or you can just mulch at the very end. And staking is also an option for the first year for maybe taller trees, or little stakes if a plant is particularly floppy, or you know that it's a wind-prone area. Maybe a little stakes to keep the plants a little more stable in the beginning is smart. So actual maintenance activities, watering. So year one's watering is probably going to be your most important time. The initial establishment watering for the plants is really critical to be done correctly. Weeding is going to be your next biggest thing. So weeds will come up with any new garden and any time you move the soil around. In the initial installation of a space, sometimes it's unavoidable that you actually have to move the soil around. If you're going to be building a swale for a rain garden, that means that you're going to be excavating some soil and moving it around. Every time you move soil around, it has the possibility of bringing up weed seeds. And so you actually end up with the biggest flush of weeds, usually in the first year of a garden. And if you stay on it, it diminishes over time. The other reason why you're weeding is because now there's a lot of empty space between the new plants. The baby plants have not really had an opportunity to fill in. So if you see here at the tip of this rocky section, there's a little plant. So look how small it is. There's another little plant in the back. There's a kind of bigger plant here, but these plants are not particularly large. And so when you're first planting a plant, you're going to plant them from a smaller size, and you're going to plant them for mature size. So if a plant gets ultimately, 10 feet wide, you don't necessarily want to put 5 of them right next to each other, a foot apart. So you're going to give a little bit more of that wide berth. But what that means is there's a lot of vacancy in the middle for weeds to come up. And so that's something that you're just going to have to be a little bit more attentive of in year one. But this mulch that you see this nice kind of thick covering of mulch, that will help. That will help reduce some of that need for weeding, because the mulch will kind of suppress some of those weeds from coming up. Tip pinching is a specific type of pruning that you can do on young plants, and especially on sages. So our native sages, sometimes like Cleveland sage, for instance, has a tendency to grow these long shoots. They get really tall and really heavy, and then in like 6 months or so, they just split down the middle, and then you end up with like this weird half split sage. So in the beginning, while plants are young, it's usually pretty smart to tip pinch. That means take off the end of the branch, just break it off at a leaf node, and then it'll send a bunch of horizontal kind of branches from that branch that you just tip pinched. And what that does is it makes it a rounder, fuller plant. And so it has a little more structural integrity. It's less likely to just kind of split open, fall over, flop on its side, etc. So tip pinching is a young plant kind of strategy. And so you might find yourself doing stuff like that in year one of a garden. Adjusting your smart controller. That smart controller would be your irrigation controller. So this is very dependent on how you're going to do irrigation, how your client wants to do irrigation, so that we can talk more about irrigation, but ultimately that's only if you choose to use a smart controller. Conceivably, a garden can be hand watered. A garden could use an oscillating sprinkler. A garden could use just manual on and off. It just depends on your ability to be at the garden site, or your client's desire to be involved or not. So sowing wildflowers, again, that's conceivably also another maintenance activity on top of just a regular activity. You can continue to sow wildflowers, but that's a seasonal thing. So you're not going to do that in the middle of summer. You're going to do that in the winter when wildflowers naturally would be germinating. And sweeping and cleaning. So this is something, it sounds very minimal, but as far as aesthetics and as far as giving a garden a sense of intentionality, it's just cleaning it and keeping mulch off of a pathway, keeping gravel off of a pathway, keeping the lines clean. That will improve the aesthetics of the garden somehow more than even the plants, even the beauty of the garden itself. I can't really overstate the importance of just basic kind of garden hygiene and just making sure that the hardscape is clean. Keep the hardscape clean, keep the lines clean. A lot of what people have against native gardens is this like, oh, it's all wild, it's all messy. And it's not that the plants are wild and messy. You can love wild and messy, but as long as the, like the pathways are clean and the environment looks well tended to, people will accept, like a little bit more of a wild habit from a plant. It's when the plants have a little bit more, maybe say of a unruly habit, but there's mulch in the walkway, there's leaves everywhere, there's no sense of, like order or boundary or cleanliness, that really kind of creates that sense that, oh, this is not a well taken care of garden. So it's not the plants themselves, it's not often even the design itself. Sometimes it's just those like very basic maintenance practices of like, let's keep the pathways swept up nicely. Let's keep the leaves. We love leaves. So when leaves fall, please don't think you have to sweep them away all the time. You can use them as a natural mulch, but put them in a designated area, like keep things in particular spaces. And that really kind of just helps improve the overall look of the garden. So now you're in year 2. So this is an example of a 2-year-old native garden. Your visits, so in the beginning we talked about, I don't know if we talked about your visits will be like probably weekly to semi-monthly. So semi-monthly being, I'm assuming, every 2 weeks, 1 to 2 hour visits to do the maintenance. But if you're doing actual installation, you might be spending all day there, for a few days to do the installation, but the actual maintenance of like making sure you've watered all the plants, you're sweeping and all that stuff, and you're weeding, maybe you're gonna have like a couple hours every week to do that. Now you're gonna start moving farther away. So now your garden is technically more established. Your plants have gotten through a full year of establishment watering. And so you can come less often. You can come less often for irrigation. You can come less often for weeding probably. And you may consider taking on a little bit more of a schedule where you come less often, but you spend a little bit longer on maybe say like weeding, or you do a little bit more seasonal work. And so just a tip, cleaning and raking will always be a part of gardens. Don't miss the opportunity to educate your client on the value of conserving fallen leaves. So again, we talked about raking and cleaning. Clean them off the pathway, put them where they belong, but leave the leaves, leave them in an area where they actually have an opportunity to decompose. Is that true for every single leaf? No. I will be honest, sycamore leaves are huge, and they sometimes will blanket your plants in a way that's problematic and difficult to manage. So if you have a big space and you can kind of say, hey, this is my spot for my sycamore leaves to just naturally decompose, great. If you have a small space, that might be something that goes in the green bin. If you have, say, like a southern magnolia street tree, which is a non-native tree, but it's used a lot in street tree in the public right-of-way scenarios, those have really thick, glossy, leathery leaves that really don't decompose at all. If you just leave them there, they kind of just like stay like little plastic leaves for a really long time. Those might be leaves that you automatically will clean up and take elsewhere. But any like oak leaves are wonderful. That's from our, from our native oak trees, for instance, and most other leaves. I leave, my Chinese elm naturally sheds. I leave it as the mulch in the understory. So you can consider using natural leaf litter as a mulch. So your maintenance activities for a second year garden would be also continuing to sow wildflowers. Where you sowed wildflowers in year one might change in year two, because the plants, as you can see, are getting bigger. So the space for being able to plant is getting smaller. And so you might say, okay, this is going to be my little designated spot for wildflowers. And that's going to be, until this plant that's right next to it gets big enough that I'm going to lose that space. And so you might need to carve out a new space, or just do it in nooks and crannies as accent pieces. So wildflowers are usually just really great to fill in a lot of empty space. Again, we talked about the first year garden having a lot of empty space. So you could conceivably, if the mulch wasn't there or the mulch was much thinner, you can do a bunch of wildflowers there. But then you're going to see, this is, believe it or not, I believe the same garden. From a different angle, you can see a little bit more that little rocky piece. And so, yeah, your wildflowers are going to be a good filler, but you're going to start to phase them out most likely in place, or so that the bigger shrubs can take over. But they can still be part of the garden as long as you kind of designate the space for them. So pruning is going to start to be a little bit more of a focus. So tip pinching we talked about, and we'll do a little bit more as far as pruning techniques in the pruning workshop. Cutting grass cutbacks. So when I'm talking about grass cutbacks, I'm not talking about a lawn. I'm not talking about mowing a lawn. We're talking about native bunch grasses. So native bunch grasses, not every single one, but most of the time, actually maybe every single one, most of them appreciate a nice cut, like a haircut all the way down to the ground. Maybe it's not a haircut, maybe a decapitation. So you want to cut them down to rejuvenate them. You don't have to do that every year, and depending on the species, there's seasonality to it, but that's something that you can start to incorporate into the maintenance strategy for a year two garden. Shearing and hedging, again, two other pruning strategies. Shearing and hedging, you will find that there aren't a ton of native shrubs that like to be formally sheared the way that you might one of those like 3-foot box hedges, but there are some that you can do that too. And hedging could be done a little bit more informally. So we talk about informal hedges, where a large evergreen shrub can provide some sort of a barrier or wall to generate more privacy or to create a wall of some sort. So you can start to do that as the plants start to mature. But in a second year garden, whether they'll be big enough for you to do that is not clear. So as far as watering, you're going to keep checking for irrigation and adjusting your smart controller if you're using a smart controller. If not, you're going to adjust the strategy for your irrigation. So in year 2, you've pretty much completed most of the establishment irrigation, and now you're moving on to a more maintenance style irrigation. And so you're going to be irrigating less by year 2. Year 1, you're not going to see water savings. So most people, they go into native plant landscaping, they think these are drought tolerant plants, I'm going to immediately start saving water. That's not true. In year 1, you're going to use as much water as a lawn, but you're going to do it in a different way. You're going to water really, really deeply and less often. By year 2, the plants will have developed their full root system, and they will be much better capable of handling less water. So by year 2, you're going to start to see the water savings, or it's going to make up for the water that you spent for year 1. And then by year 3, you're actually going to see the savings. So just keep that in mind, that the water will be changing year to year. And by year 2, you're going to start to really taper off. Repair-based activities that you might encounter in a year 2 garden. Again, this could be in your personal garden if this is relevant to your personal space, or a space that you steward that isn't your own, residence. But year 2 repair-based activities would be something like replanting. So say you planted something and the gophers ate them all, or you planted something and the neighbor's dog peed on it. Things are going to happen. So account for that kind of, also in your proposal, like a little bit of, say if you do a formal proposal to a client, or just in your head when you're thinking about, hey, the cost of this endeavor, keep a contingency fund in mind for those kinds of scenarios. Hey, the neighbor's kid threw a basketball and it hit the plant and it broke in half. So you might find yourself doing some repair in year 2. You're going to continue doing weeding. And so that's something that is going to be ongoing, but hopefully by year 2, you'll be doing a little bit less of it. Culling plants that are not thriving. So by year 2, you might not get that impression. I would actually hold off culling plants till maybe year 3. But culling non-thriving plants, if the plant is like actually dying, then certainly removing it and replacing it with something that's going to be more vigorous is ideal. But if it's just not growing, that's not necessarily a bad sign. So there's this little phrase or adage in the native plant world about native plants and how they grow. And it's the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. So that's not necessarily the exact same formula across all plants. Like annuals leap in their first year, perennials kind of creep and leap in their first year, but the shrubs are more like sleep, creep, leap. But generally speaking, if it's not moved from one year to the next, that's not a death sentence. That's not necessarily a horrible thing. Remember that the plants are doing most of their work underground first. So they're doing their work underground, and then they're going to show you their top growth. But if they don't have that opportunity to do that underground work, you're not really going to see much on top. So be patient when it comes to native plants. They might not grow as quickly as your usual kind of garden store, Home Depot, fertilizer fed, non-native species, but you're trying to create a really robust root system that has a lot of integrity. And sometimes that means that they're going to just kind of hold off on showing you above ground growth for a little while. That said, don't be like me and keep waiting forever for a particular manzanita to start growing, because I planted a baby bear manzanita 7 years ago and it hasn't moved since then. It hasn't died, but it hasn't moved. And in that scenario, it should be pulled, but I can't I can't do it. But I would recommend if it was a client's garden, I get to make that choice of just letting it be there. But in a client's garden where say they want everything to look like it's growing and thriving, you may consider removing something that for 7 years hasn't grown. Even if it hasn't died, if it's not growing, it's not actually happy. Remulching, if you have a scenario where the mulch is peeled away, it's already decomposed, maybe it blew away in a wind or something like that, remulching could possibly be a yearly task that you do. Usually mulch can last longer than a year, but on the off chance that it was, you did it really thinly or something happened, you may consider adding more mulch to a garden. Staking again, you can consider, if something were to happen where a plant fell over and needed to be staked, that's again a repair-based activity that you might consider. And then cleaning rain swales and rain gardens annually before the rainy season. So one thing that will happen in a rain garden or one of those swales, like a fake dry creek bed that captures the water, is sometimes leaves will collect in there and make it kind of like gum it up. So cleaning that out, making sure that's free of weeds is also really important. And if dirt or other debris has gotten in there, trying to like use a trowel or I would say like use a shop vac or something to suck it all out and kind of clean it up. Just make sure you're not pulling up gravel or anything at the same time. So look how beautiful that is now. So for those of you, let's see if I can tell what all these are. All right. Okay, so in the foreground here, if you can see my cursor, this is a annual wildflower called elegant Clarkia. So this is going to be your once it blooms in the spring, dies back, and then you pull it away. So this is your annual. Behind it here is a sage, a type of Cleveland sage. And then we have in the foreground here a tree. It looks like a Palo Verde tree. And then on the right corner, it looks like probably Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. And behind it, in the background, is a big white sage. And so this is just a really nice dynamic garden. I would say probably May, June, a June garden, possibly. So you can see lots of things blooming at the same time, and the plants are pretty mature. The only one that's still pretty young is the tree, because obviously this tree can be much larger than that. But generally speaking, it is a pretty mature garden by year 3, and you're going to start to feel that a third year garden is like, okay, my garden is full now. It looks real, looks legit. And so I would say, like, be really patient, whether it's your own garden or a client's garden. If you're working with clients who are not familiar with native landscapes, part of your job is going to be about being able to communicate and manage their expectations in a way that sets them and you up for success and doesn't make them think that you're doing anything wrong. You want them to know, like, hey, it takes about 3 years for the garden to start to feel really full. So that's something to keep in mind. It takes about 3 years. You can still fill it with wildflowers and give them like a kind of a temporary fix if they don't like to see a lot of bald spots. But as far as the shrubs and the perennials really looking full, you can kind of set them up with that understanding. So keep that in mind. Somebody asked the Clarkia, the tree was a Palo Verde for Ari, who asked. Clarkia unguiculata specifically is elegant Clarkia. So there's different kinds of Clarkia. That one is called elegant Clarkia. And perfect, somebody just put a link in the chat to calscape.org. Please use calscape.org as a reference. There's a lot of really great references aside from the Theodore Payne website that has its own plant database. Calscape.org is an excellent searchable database for native plants. The other one that's really great, but is not as current and is slightly less local, would be the Las Palitas website. So that was the one that I kind of like, I don't want to say grew up on, because I didn't as a child grow up on that website, but that's the one that really tuned me into native plants. And so they're in the Santa Margarita area. and they treat their plants a little bit differently than we might in an LA garden, but it has tons of photos and tons of really good information from the late Bert Wilson, who used to run that nursery. Somebody else. So the growth that we're seeing in the photo, so Ryan asks, the growth has been over a couple of years, or is this over a few months with proper care? The growth that we're seeing in the latest photo, with all of those flowers that I highlighted, that's at a 3rd year mark. So 3 years, it's been fully growing for the last 2 years. Now we're into the 3rd year. So this is a 3-year-old garden. So you're not really gonna get just a few months this kind of an impact. The only time you can do that is when you're jamming it full of annual wildflowers, and then that's a seasonal temporary fix to give like that appearance of fullness. But then those die off, you have to remove them, the dead matter, and then your shrubs are still, still growing. Somebody also asks, how do we prevent the mulch from choking out potential wildflowers in the beginning? And so would you recommend planting starts instead of seeds? So that's a very great question. You can definitely, hold on, I'm just writing. Test.com, I believe, is the website for that other resource. So the fortunate thing with mulch is that it suppresses weeds because it creates kind of a barrier between the seeds that are trying to access sunlight, or the plant itself is trying to access sunlight, and the sunlight itself. And so unfortunately, wildflowers are kind of in that same category of plants as weeds, in the sense that they also need to access sunlight. So anything you're going to do to favor wildflowers is also going to favor weeds. And so if you want wildflowers to germinate, you actually have to either keep a very thin layer of mulch or no mulch at all. So if you're going to do wildflower gardening, do minimal to no mulch. If you're going to, you want the mulch to be there, you can definitely do starts. So starts would be like smaller plugs, smaller wildflowers that you plant out. Poppies are very easy to do from that size. Some of the other ones are a little bit more ephemeral wildflowers that, you'll get a few plants, but poppies tend to like kind of fill out and look really full, even whether you do it from a seed or from a start. All right. So somebody also asked, would you suggest sunscreens for full sun south facing areas for a new planting site for 1 gallon species? I will say no. And the reason why I'll say that is that, one, you want to plant plants that are adapted to the conditions that you're putting them in. If the plant is not going to tolerate south facing scenario at maturity, or when it's bigger or robust, like, it shouldn't go in there. If you're concerned that it can as an adult, but from a 1 gallon size, from a nursery that maybe grew it under shade cloth, is going to suffer, I recommend, rather than using a sunscreen of any kind or any kind of a barrier or umbrella or anything like that, just make sure you're planting in the appropriate season such that they have time to acclimate. So I would recommend planting like in January or December, when it's cooler. The temperatures are never going to get too crazy. Even in the sun right now in January, we're having a hot, dry January technically, but it's still not going to like fry a plant. So just plant in the cooler months of the year. That's recommended across most native plants. And especially in the scenario where you're concerned, like a fresh, softer, small nursery grown 1 gallon might be a little less resilient, you're gonna just make sure for that one that you're just planting in the right season. And that's all you need to do. I wouldn't worry about actually putting any kind of barrier to protect them. they should also just learn to get like tough. And it might be helpful to check the nursery conditions. So if you're going and you're like, oh, this was grown under shade cloth under a tree and it's supposed to be in full sun, maybe you'll question whether or not that's a good practice for that nursery, and maybe say, hey, listen, I'm putting this, it's supposed to take full sun and you're growing it in the shade. You know, nursery conditions should somewhat mimic what the plant is supposed to do naturally, so, or in the wild or in nature, and then eventually in the garden. So you want to make sure that the nursery itself is also kind of setting the plant up for success. So in year 3, you're again, your actual visits to the garden are going to be semi-monthly to monthly visits of 3 to 4 hours. You can adapt this. I know that Andreas Hessing of Scrub J Studios, who by the way, always needs maintenance workers for his incredible, like, award-winning gardens. He does like multiple full days, but only once a season. So like you'll go in winter and you'll spend 3 solid days there, but then you're not going again till like 3 months later. And so that's the strategy that he's figured out works for him or for his crew. And so you might find that, you know, you're going to be able to adapt your strategy. Maybe it's a seasonal visit that you spend much longer there. You do all the weeding all at that one visit, and then you do all your spring. You know, winter and spring will probably be focused on weeding and light pruning. And then your summer is going to be like a heavier pruning. Fall, another, you know, maybe heavy pruning, maybe replanting. So just kind of figure out which strategy works for you. But generally speaking, you're going to be doing less and less maintenance over time. You're never not going to be doing maintenance, and you're always going to be changing and growing, and the garden's always going to be changing and evolving. So for instance, if you've planted a tree and it was in a 5-gallon pot when you planted it, by, you know, in 10 years, it's going to start shading the plants that normally were in the sun right next to it. Now they're in the shade. So you might have to swap them out and put different plants that can tolerate the shade. So your maintenance is never going to go away. And your adjustments to the garden are never going to go away, which is great for job security, that you can always find something to do. And your client's always going to probably have certain needs or desires for their garden. All right. Okay, and so this tip was kind of what I mentioned that Andreas Hessing does with Scrub J Studios. And then a question was asked about, with wildflowers, how do you tell whether it's a wildflower or a weed? And unfortunately, in that scenario, it's one of those things where you kind of just have to know by experience. You can also try to look up. For instance, I was just on Instagram, and it was like Neil's Nursery or something like that, just like posted a bunch of baby wildflower photos, like, hey, this is what the little baby seedlings look like. And so you can see them like, yep, that's a little Clarkia popping up. That's what a whatever fill in the blank wildflower looks like coming up. Theodore Payne also had, I believe it was an intern to a project where they kind of did the same thing, where they took seedling photos of everything. So it might be worth it to check out, kind of contact Theodore Payne, see if that's a reference or a resource that you guys can look into or get. Because quite a few people have like done that to try to make sense of, is this a wildflower, is this a weed? And I believe that has been done on a certain scale. Whether that's available in a handout or if it's something they can just email you is not quite clear yet. All right. So activities in year 3 will be remulching. We talked about that again. Again, don't remulch if you don't have to, but that can be an activity that you do. Pruning is going to start to become a real thing for you starting in year 3. So ideally, you would have planted plants that don't require intense pruning. Not that the plant itself doesn't require it, but that you would have planted it in such a way that wouldn't require intense pruning. So for instance, if you planted a ground cover sage, which I think I'm looking at in the foreground here, and say you planted it, it's a little close to the walkway, but this is actually okay. But say you planted it 1 foot from the walkway and it's going to get 6 feet wide. a good 2 feet easily, you're going to have to start cutting off the one end over and over every year because you planted it too close to the walkway. So you have to keep in mind the spread, and you need to have designed the garden in such a way that when it gets to mature size, it's not going to require repeated pruning. You really want to focus your pruning on what is going to improve the health of the plant, what might encourage maybe more flowering, what is going to improve the structural integrity of the plant and general tidiness of the plant, but not real heavy duty repair work on like, hey, the plant has completely blocked the walkway, and I have to hack it back, you know, to half of its original size just so that we can get to our front door. So that's something that's part of that whole planning process. I talked about the most labor you're going to be doing is in that upfront first year, because it takes a lot of care to think in advance of what is this going to look like, because our instinct is this is tiny, I can put it, you know, in this tiny corner, without thinking that by year 3 it's going to be 6 feet wide all around. And so those are things to consider. Your pruning should really not be heavy duty correcting pruning, except when you have to. It really should be more for just kind of general aesthetics, tidiness, structural, you know, integrity, but not because you made an error in plant placement when you first planted it. Pulling overgrown plants. So I guess maybe this photo is supposed to say this is an overgrown plant. You can pull overgrown plants if they get exceedingly large beyond, say, what you anticipated, and they're starting to look old or showing their age and looking kind of weathered, and maybe they're not blooming as well anymore. Then you can say this plant has kind of like aged out of the garden. But by year 3, you really, I wouldn't say you'd be pulling out plants. That's again, if they're overgrown, it's because you've made an error in year 1 about placement. And that's fine. You can say like, okay, I made an error and there's no way to prune this gracefully. I'm just going to pull it and plant something smaller. So you might be making, again, repairs in year 3 that you didn't anticipate. But hopefully you will have made the right kind of plant placement choices in the beginning so that you don't have to do that. Because that's one thing that, you know, a client can get upset when it's like, oh, this looks so big and scraggly and ratty. And so you might be doing them a favor by pulling it, but sometimes the client gets really attached to a plant. And so the idea that you're going to have to pull something out because you made a mistake in placing it could kind of break their heart sometimes. So just keep those things in mind and make sure that you're being really judicious about where you're placing your plants. Again, cleaning rain swales and rain gardens annually. You can still do your, sowing wildflower seeds wherever it makes sense. Those kinds of things are just repeated year after year, things that you can do. Year 3, again, oh, look at this nice corner. These are Dudleas, so the succulents at the bottom. We'll do a little bit, I don't know, let's see. So this was a ground cover stage. I want to do a little plant ID each time we're looking at stuff. This looks like a ground cover coyote brush. This in the back might either be that white sage again. I think that's the white sage, or it might be a St. Catherine's lace buckwheat. I'm not 100% sure about that. Somebody in the chat says that in the free Waterwise landscaping classes, they say to clip the weeds back continuously instead of pulling them out to reduce disturbing the soil. That's 100% a valid strategy. So if you are on site enough that you can just continually clip them back to prevent them from flowering and reseeding, eventually in the summer, they will just like die out. If you have an annual weed, they'll just die out. And then you haven't, again, disturbed the soil by pulling up the roots. So pulling up roots and bringing up soil can fluff up the seed bank and create more of a weed situation later on. So sometimes clipping it is actually a very good strategy. But you could also pull. I tend to pull if you're not going to be able to be on site over and over and make sure they just repeatedly will not flower. Pulling just ends it. It ends their life. You're done. Perennial weeds, the ones that come up, say from underground root structures or little bulbets or things like that, those become a little more complicated. we'll talk a little more about weeds later on in the weeding and IPM course. But as far as IDing, so these plants down here, these are Dudleyias. All right, we're at 7:30. I'm just trying to watch my time. These are Dudleyias. These are native succulents. They like good drainage. We have, I honestly can't tell what I'm looking at there. Hummingbird sage next to them potentially. So that's a fragrant, beautiful kind of ground cover, larger leafed sage. So year 3, replanting, again, every year might be a thing that you do. Weeding is continuous watering. You're gonna, again, check your irrigation. So now in year 3, you have a mature garden. You're gonna be doing minimal irrigation by this time. Year 4, again, look how gorgeous this is. So in the foreground, this kind of dusty leaved with the orange flowers, that's apricot mallow. Fantastic, full sun, desert species, but works in non-desert scenarios as long as it's in full sun, and has phenomenal kind of pollinator support. Digger bees love them, and their desert tortoises will eat the leaves of that if you have any California desert tortoises in your care. And then it looks like there's a coast bush sunflower behind it, a very flowery plant, and then behind that a very happy, again, what looks like a white sage. So year 4, mature garden, it's all the same kinds of things. Remulch if you need to. Pruning, so more vegetation means larger cuts, long-term planting and shaping. So your pruning is going to get a little bit more potentially specialized in this scenario, and monitoring. So again, unless you have heavy duty changes like, the client wants to scrape this whole side and do a new plant palette completely. If you're leaving it mature, it's going to be about making sure that the pruning is really nice. The cleanliness is always still going to be a factor. So make sure things are still really clean and nice. And then just, this is a wonderful opportunity to just enjoy the garden. So weeding, replanting, watering, checking for irrigation. So this garden was on the Native Plant Garden Tour. You can see those elegant Clarkias in the foreground again, looking amazing. Very full, very flowery. This was probably, if it was at the garden tour, is probably taken in April. So remember that the native garden is seasonal. So what this garden looks like in the summer is going to be different than in the spring, which is different in the fall and different in the winter. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, and something that would go into year 1 is when you're making your plant list and considering the plant palette, researching when different plants bloom at what time of the year, and making sure there's some kind of visual interest throughout the year is really great. So one of the things that people tend to do is, I want to pick all the most flowery things, and they end up picking everything that blooms in spring. And then by summertime, the garden looks like dormant. And so, but to get some summer bloomers, some spring bloomers, some winter bloomers. So you have manzanitas and ceanothus that bloom in the wintertime, early spring. You have buckwheats that'll bloom in the late spring, summer, fuchsias that will do like summer, fall. And so getting a nice variety is really important. So I want to stress that as your year 1 thinking strategy. But even in year 3, year 4, if you start to see like, this section of the garden looks pretty darn dead by September, maybe that's where you throw in a California fuchsia. You say like, I'm going to pull this guy out. I'm going to put a California fuchsia in here because I know that blooms with red tubular flowers that attract hummingbirds, and it does it in like September, October, November. So, so those are little tweaks that you can do. Again, it could be your private garden, could be a client's garden. So this is a video that will probably not show. So I might have to stop the share. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop the share, open it up, and then we're going to put the captions on because the audio was not working when we were testing it. So I'm going to stop the share, find the link, share my YouTube, share the YouTube video, and then get back to the PowerPoint. So bear with me for 1 second while I do that. And if you have questions from anything that we've talked about until now, feel free to enter that into the chat now, and then we can answer them after this quick kind of like video tutorial. All right, so hopefully you'll be able to see this in just a minute. Hold on. Sorry, this is taking longer than I anticipated. Okay, can you see the screen? I think you can. All right, so I'm going to play this. This is a tutorial on planting a native plant. So this is something that was generated at Theodore Payne by Tim Becker, who is the director of horticulture. So he gives just a little tutorial on how to plant. This is something that we are going to do in person at Tree People during the irrigation workshop, because believe it or not, the irrigation component of planting a new plant is actually very important for getting it established. But this is just a quick little tutorial that you guys can get. And we're just going to do the closed captioning here because the volume wasn't really quite working. So hopefully that will. This is not very helpful. Okay. Baja Blanca, maybe I'll do a little narrating. Mixed sunlight condition. So now he has the plant and he knows where he's going to plant it, and he's going to prepare the site. He's going to clear any weeds away when he digs this hole. So he is digging in a scenario in Theodore Payne where it's kind of like a little more of a wildland setting. So hopefully you will have tackled all the weeds of a particular site. But you can see that it's weed free. This is very loose soil. So this is decomposed granite soil. Your client's soil will be slightly different. And it's very dry. And so he knows it's dry because he's handling the soil, he's squishing it, and it's just crumbling. It's completely like sand. And so he is going to hydrate the hole. This is a really important aspect of planting, is with a dry condition. You want to hydrate the hole itself and wait for it to drain. So you can do a drainage test to see what kind of fast draining or slow draining soil you might have at your space or your client's garden. And that's going to impact the kind of plants that you plant as well. Let the water drain out. It's time to place the plant inside. So you can see that it's actually sunken. It's actually buried too far down in this scenario. You want it to be at level or slightly above grade. So if he planted it just like that, he would just swamp it with just too much soil. So he's going to backfill some of the stuff that he took out. He's going to repair the level. Now he's pulling the plant out. Depending on the species, you can do some teasing of the roots. You can open up the roots a bit, but this species is a little more touchy. So you can see that he just placed it in just gently, and he's backfilling with native soil. You can see he's not using compost. He's not adding fertilizer. You don't need to. Native plants are adapted to natural soils, more thin, nutrient poor soils. So that kind of composty, rich, organic soils that you associate with most styles of gardening is not what you would necessarily do with native plants. And now he's building kind of a berm around there so that you can make this little basin so that when you water, the water is staying pooled in there. So that was that. And in the chat, what is the planting depths for most species for new topsoil, non-native soil? For example, the site with new 8 foot depth of backfill. I don't know that I quite understand the question. When your planting depth is always going to be basically the size of the pot that you're planting. And so if you're, 8 foot of soil is plenty to plant into. Yeah, the same height of the pot is what I would say, or at least the same height of the soil within the pot. So sometimes there's going to be like a 1 inch or 2 inch, gap or extra space where in the nursery they water it and it gets the pool. So plant the root ball. The same height of the root ball is how deep you will plant any kind of plant. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. All right. Right there. Oh, we're back to the beginning. All right, guys. Just gonna start over. So year 4, we saw your video. Okay, so now we're going to see an example of a garden, and feel free to start adding some things in the chat because this is a question for you guys. So, and I can explain also what I would do, but I'd love to see some of your ideas. So what would you do each year in this garden? So this is going to be an example of a garden. I think it's in Lamart Park, and this is a front yard conversion. They are using decomposed granite in lieu of wood bark mulch. So they've added a layer of decomposed granite to the top, kind of scraped the original lawn and weeds off, and they're adding a few inches of decomposed granite and they're planting directly in that. So this is year 1. Based on what you're seeing here as evidence, what are some activities that you can see is happening here, would happen here, and what kind of maintenance activities would you suspect would need to happen once, say, these plants were planted? I'm going to start filling the chat with some of your answers. If you don't want to answer, that's cool too.
Catherine, I think we're stuck on the first page of your PowerPoint.
Oh, are other people having an issue with the PowerPoint? Okay, other people text me. Okay, everyone is. Okay, thank you for that feedback. Okay, I got it. So let me, how about now? Okay, so what would you do each year in this garden? Okay, you're seeing it move side to side. All right. So now we're in. Yes, anytime there's a weird technical snafu, feel free to do that. On the off chance that I'm not looking at the chat and I'm just rambling on because I haven't paid attention to the things you're saying in the chat, if you want to unmute yourself and be like, Catherine, like there's a technical issue, please feel free. Most of the time I am checking the chat, so you don't always have to, think to do that. But if the lesson is going on without you, please feel free to vocalize. Okay, so now we're in this this front yard transition from what used to be what I believe is a lawn. Scraped the top lawn off and a few inches of soil, and then they brought some decomposed granite. And they're going to plant in it. So you can offer your suggestions about what you think would be some of the activities and things for this garden. One thing that's a little bit different about this garden over some of the other ones we looked at is their mulch application is the decomposed granite. So they're using decomposed granite in lieu of wood chip mulch. They're using it kind of like as like a gravel mulch, but decomposed granite, it's kind of like hiking trail dirt, like it's the granite hillsides that fall apart into almost like a near gravelly sand kind of consistency. So it's a very natural material for many of the native plants to be growing in. And in this case, it's being used kind of more as a top dressing. So what are some of the things, so what are some of the activities of a first year garden installation like this? Placing a swale at the lower slope. Are they all the same plants? I believe it's different kinds of plants. I don't think it's all the same. That would have been smart. Yeah. So this was not done for the rebate program, but generally speaking, thinking about the water and how it moves would have been a really great first year consideration. I don't think that in this scenario they did that. I could be wrong. It could be in a different section that I'm not seeing, but taking, if they have like a downspout and having you go maybe underground part of the way and then creating a depression maybe in different spots where maybe you can plant some plants that take that seasonal flooding, but it has a chance to percolate rather than rushing off, because it does look like it is sloping downward a little bit. So that would have been a good opportunity. Yes, a berm or swale to capture the rainwater, good for Raul. Where's the north? That's a good question. It would be good to know whether this amount of shade, whether this is a north facing exposure. So conceivably this could be a north facing home, which means, and that's a very good point of the lesson, the sunlight's going to hit differently on this yard depending on what direction the house is facing. If it's north facing, it's going to be in a lot of shade. If it's south facing, it's going to be in a lot of sun. If it's east facing, it's going to have morning sun and shade in the afternoon. And if it's west facing, it's going to have shade in the morning, but sun in the afternoon. So in order of coolest and shadiest to hottest and driest and harshest, it goes north, east, west, south, as far as the orientations of what direction each wall or each part of the building is facing. So if you're talking about, I need to plant a shrub against a north facing wall, you need a very shade tolerant shrub. If you need to plant a shrub against a south facing wall, you need a very heat and sun tolerant shrub. So understanding how the sun and shade exposure changes season to season is very important. So these are all really important considerations. And that consideration is prior to what plant you choose to plant. So those are the things that you have to plan out before you've even made a selection. So evaluating the runoff was another example. Again, really great suggestion. I do also think that it's north facing. I seem to recall that, and it's possible it's north facing at a time of the year where the shadows are really long. So north facing in August is different than north facing in January. North facing in January is going to show a really long shadow. North facing in August, by high noon, you actually are going to get pretty harsh sun straight overhead. Ella says the sighting on the implementation of what kind of irrigation style you're going to be using for this garden is very important. So are we going to stick to hand watering? Are we going to be using an oscillating sprinkler? Do we install a sprinkler system, drip irrigation system, etc.? So those are all decisions, and also the actual installation of those things are critical to do in this year one. Calling 811 to map out the underground utility is really important. So anytime you're going to be doing big kinds of digging, you're going to call dig alert. Dig alert will map out what's underground. If there's a big, public sewer line or something like that, or any kind of electricity or irrigation or such, that if you hit it, it would be a real big disaster. They can map it out for you so that you kind of know what you're doing, especially if you're going to be digging any kind of swales or doing any kind of planting of large planting holes. I will say I've had my share of accidents, and by my share I mean one really bad accident where I was planting a 15-gallon tree and I hit a main water line. This was a residential water line. It wasn't, a public utility, but it was the residence, the 85-year-old lady home's residential water line that sent a geyser of water and doused her in her beautiful sunset, or like Sunday outfit that she was ready to go to her friends. It was horrible. So don't do that. Please make sure that you're calling 811, or that you're just being very careful as well about how you're digging, as far as the intensity with which you're digging your hole. Make sure you are always aware if you're hitting something hard, it might not be a rock, it might be a pipe. So just be very careful. It's better to be cautious and slower than try to rush. All right, so how much water? It is less terrible than hitting a gas line. This was a repairable issue. Gas line would be horrible for sure. All right, so great. These were all phenomenal suggestions, and you guys are totally right with how to move forward with this garden. So, so let's say they've planted it. Next stage. So what you can see here is a largely, remember how I said in the first year, the plants are very small, and so you often will want to use your wildflowers as a filler. So this is only year one, and if you look in this bottom left corner, it's pretty much full, but it's mostly full of poppies, which are a wildflower, which is fantastic. This is an incredible pollinator kind of front yard space and really great wildlife habitat. But you can see that they've used the annual as a fast fill. So that's a strategy that you will use. So next, I want to ask you, what do you think maintenance-wise would be needed in year 2, considering what this garden looks like, and considering this particular fact that wildflowers have a season and then they have an off season, and their off season is usually when they die, they set seed, they look brown. So what we're seeing here is probably late spring. What would the same garden look like in October? And what kind of strategies would we have, and what kind of maintenance activities would we be doing for this particular garden? Yes, so Ari's saying, won't those die completely in the end of summer? Poppies can sometimes stay alive with their underground root, but generally speaking, yes, it's an annual, we call it an annual. Most annual wildflowers, by end of summer, they you want to leave them long enough to set seeds so that you can get them next year. So and also so that their seeds can feed the birds. So they have a purpose even when you let them complete their cycle. But the spaces where you're seeing poppies are eventually going to get empty. So that's very accurate. So we're going to enjoy until it starts looking all brown. All the seeds are released from the capsules. And after that point, we're going to have to do some maintenance, which is either the strategy where you cut them down. That's actually a smart choice in case they decide to shoot up again. You cut them down or you pull them out. All right. Time to infill with possible different species for seasonal interest. So for instance, like we talked about, like, hey, maybe we want to put fuchsias here because, you know, or even better, you have annuals that come up in the winter and they bloom in the spring and early summer, and then they die off. Then you have some other species like Sacred Datura, which is technically toxic if you eat it, but is otherwise a phenomenal plant. Sacred Datura and milkweed, for instance. Milkweed for monarch butterflies. We have that monarch champion in the audience. And so those are warm season plants. So those come up when it's hot. So when your poppies die off and your clarkias die off and your annuals die off, these would get activated. And so what I love to do is intermix those two so that you get your cool season stuff come up while those are dormant. And then when those die, your warm season perennials come up. So that's an option. So cleaning up the dead plant material after the poppies die off is exactly right. So pruning is kind of a no-no in a poppy garden. Pruning is not that it's a no-no. Pruning is cleanup in the case of a garden that's like mostly poppies right now. It would just be cleaning out dead material. But you wouldn't have much to do as far as more structural pruning or more nuanced pruning activities in this scenario. It's more like cleanup. Given the style of the neighborhood, is it okay to trim the wildflowers off the driveway? Absolutely. You can trim anything that you want. You can trim it off the driveway and keep a super clean line, or you can allow a little spillover for a more naturalized look. This is not, I wouldn't say that this is unclean, this level of like kind of spilling over. I think that actually looks pretty good. The other, but when you have, say, like a lot of debris or leafy debris or dirt, say the decomposed granite was always spilling over the driveway, you want to make sure that those are always kept clean. The other thing that I'm thinking of, just because if wildflowers are doing this well, the possibility of weeds coming up to compete with them is high. So weeding is going to have to be a prime focus during this time. Pruning and weeding. Roger asked, why not start with more variety? That's entirely, justified question. Why only poppies? There are so many other wildflowers we can choose. So this was just a creative choice by the homeowner or the designer. I don't know if it was homeowner or designer. And so you could start with more variety instead, or you can stick with, say, a fan favorite. Pruning and weeding, because the crossover of wildflowers and weeds thriving, absolutely. Cutting back wildflowers. Raul suggests this might have been a request or a supply issue. Maybe they just had all the poppies in the poppy seeds were in much higher supply at the nursery, and that's, or maybe they tried a mix and the poppies were the ones that often happens. Poppies are so vigorous. Sometimes they're the ones that just succeed in a wildflower mix. So if you want a guaranteed wildflower that comes up, it's the poppies and it's that elegant Clarkia. Those are the two that you'll have a hard time ever getting rid of. Preparing the client for dormancy. This was a direct message, but Barry has posted it. Keeping the eye on the prize of the legacy plants. I love this because it's managing expectations, which we talked about with the client, making sure that they're aware, like, hey, this is what it's going to look like in the spring and maybe early summer. Be prepared what it's going to look like after. But remember that the plants, those few maybe shrubs that we planted in the mix, those are going to come up. So just kind of like be patient and wait for that. Poppies are great for cultivating the soil. It's an early adaptation plant. Yeah, wildflowers too. After, say, fire, in a place where the seed bank is good, they tend to be one of the first that come back up. So those are fantastic suggestions for this 1 year, 2 year. We're at the second year garden now. All right, totally different, right? So this is year 3, so very different. First of all, I don't see more than just a handful of poppies. Everything else is pretty much a shrub. We've got yarrow, shrub or perennials. So what looks like a bunch of yarrow, penstemon spectabilis or showy penstemon here. Can't quite tell if that's a sage, but we definitely have sagebrush over here, and a much more naturalistic garden. And it looks like slightly off season. So late, I would say maybe this is like a late summer, mid to late summer garden. So end of season for poppies, penstemons, or maybe this is early. This is either before the big blooms. This might be early. Some native grasses, bunch grasses. So again, a more naturalistic garden. If anyone has suggestions for what to do in this stage. So we've got a comment that this is gorgeous. And you couldn't even see these plants in the first 2 years, which is very kind of cool, that you're really starting to see the form take off. But you see a lot of empty spaces as well. So conceivably, you could sow wildflowers in these empty spots. Light pruning for shaping. George is suggesting some light pruning, and I think that's smart. You could do some of that tip pruning we talked about, or if things seem to be getting a little unruly, just some light pruning to keep things a little more kind of compact or contained. Anything that's spilling over, there isn't much, but in the bottom, there's like maybe a little bit that maybe we can prune off the walkway, but honestly, a little bit of naturalized overflow is fine. When I said, keep clean lines, I don't mean make it look, like like a fake landscape, as long as it's not impeding any kind of foot traffic. And as long as like dirt or mulch is not actually on the walkway. In this case, the pathways are clear. A little bit of plant material on a walkway is actually naturalistic, very nice aesthetic. If it's clean, it just becomes a problem when you have a narrow walkway, say like a 2-foot walkway, and your plants are coming like 6 inches on one side, 6 inches on another, and you've got this little tightrope of a pathway that you can actually walk on. That's when it becomes an issue. But this design of this home and the front entryway is really expansive and large and really kind of lends itself nicely to having a little bit of plant overflow. All right, so last one. Ta-da! So here you see wildflowers and shrubs and penstemons. So this purple pink sprays, that's Penstemon spectabilis. We have our poppies, which is a fan favorite. And what looks like here, this looks like blue flax to me, which is a perennial that has really cool blue flowers. Plus we've got intermixing of grasses, sagebrush, and what looks like sages as well. So now we would say this is a more mature garden. Of course, it is in a season of abundant flowers. And so it's going to be a slightly different garden in September. But this time of year would probably focus on weeding, making sure that the weeds aren't competing with any of these plants. Your irrigation, if it's winter or spring, you might choose to supplement heavier irrigation in lieu of rainfall. So if we don't get rainfall for say like January, like we have now, you might say, all right, we're gonna do a nice deep irrigation of this landscape to mimic a rainstorm that we're not getting. So you might choose to tailor the irrigation to the natural cycles now that your garden's more mature, rather than do kind of a more unnatural schedule of the establishment irrigation. So those are some adaptations that you can do. So this is a mature, beautiful, habitat-rich kind of garden. And from a comment that I heard the previous instructor make when I watched her present this is a hugely valuable ground nesting bee habitat. So our native bees, unlike the European honeybee, which is an imported bee, many of our native bees are ground nesters. They don't form colonies, they don't form hives. They nest in the ground in open dirt. And so dirt with wildflowers, you can see there's no mulch. The mulch would have kept the bees from being able to use this as habitat. So the fact that it's decomposed granite with lots of wildflowers and some empty pockets of space, this is a very rich ground nesting bee habitat that the previous instructor said she's been on site, she's seen it, and she's seen all the bees coming in and out. And this is not stinging bees, these are not dangerous bees. I'm not saying like, oh my God, it's an infestation of bees, but this is just to show you how it's appealing for native habitat to have this kind of a landscape. And that's the whole point of this, is to try to make an ecologically rich and dynamic space. There is no experience of walking through the garden. That's a good point. Yeah, the experience of walking through the garden would probably be limited to, in this space from a design perspective, walking up the walkway. That will be the experience of walking through the garden. If you wanted to create an experience of walking through, creating little maybe stepping stone pathways through it is definitely an option. It just depends on what you want and what the client wants. If they want to be able to sit in their walkway. Front yards are also a little different than backyards. So front yard, you might be a little bit more hands-off. I just want to generate habitat. Backyard, I want more pathways. I want a seat. I want a bench. It's a little more private. So some people tend to spend less time in a front yard compared to a backyard. And so you can jam it full of habitat with a little less of that human desire to interact with the space. So that's a consideration to think about if it's public facing. Maybe you focus on just generating as much habitat as possible with your native landscape. If it's in the backyard, then you focus a little more on the human element of how do they meander through the space and enjoy taking their time there. So those are all little, considerations. So your homework assignment, isn't this exciting? You feel like we're at 8 o'clock. We're back in, I don't know, middle school. So your homework assignment is to take 3 pictures of native plants wherever. They can be in your yard, they can be in a client's garden, they can be in the wild, if you can go on a hike in Griffith Park, and you want to take 3 pictures of native plants and send them to me to my email. So write down my email, wildergardens@gmail.com. I will ask that you put in the subject line homework, HW : your name. Don't write the words your name. Please write your actual name. It'll be very funny if you did that, but please don't. Please put homework, your first name and last name in the subject line, and just send me attached 3 photos of native plants that you see. If you can identify them, if you know what they are, feel free to ID them. If you can't, I'm not expecting you to. So just if you think they're native, take the photos. You may find that you think a native plant is native and it's not actually from California at all. So that's going to be one of the things that we get out of this. Like, is your ability to identify something as native or non-native up to speed, or is that something that we should focus on a little bit more? So definitely shoot me an email, wildergardens@gmail.com, your name with homework in the subject line. I'll go back to the email so you can write it, but I just want to see if the last slide is the last slide. Yes, it is. That is the last slide. Okay. So if anyone needs more time, if anyone needs to linger for another 5 minutes to ask a question or something like that, feel free. But otherwise, we've hit our limit for the time. We are past 8 o'clock. This was fantastic to get to know you guys and to hear all of your feedback in the chat. I love that back and forth, and I encourage you to do more of it. If there's anything about this course that wasn't working well, please let me know so that next time we can, make sure it does work well.